several years ago, I wrote a very long essay called Black American Culture and the Racial Wealth Gap, in which I pointed out cultural features, like cultural behavior patterns that were not identical between Black Americans and white Americans and Asians that have consequences in terms of wealth accumulation. And I showed some data from, Nielsen has some data that rarely gets cited, but they just count the number of hours spent watching TV by race, because that's what we trust Nielsen to do. And they do consumer market research. So they ask you, have you bought jewelry in the past year? Have you bought jewelry worth more than $500 in the past year? And on all of these questions, you find Black Americans more likely, often significantly more likely, to say they've purchased jewelry in the past year, purchased expensive jewelry in the past year, more likely than white Americans. And that's not holding income constant. So you're comparing a poorer population to a wealthier population, not holding anything constant, and finding the poorer population much more likely to buy luxury items. And so I just made this straightforward point. This is a feature of this is a cultural feature of the Black community. And just like the trademark argumentativeness around the dinner table that I think many, certainly Ashkenazi Jews, would recognize as a cultural feature, and certainly I do, having grown up in a heavily Jewish area, it's not shared by all people of that culture, and may not even be shared by most, but it's shared to a degree that is recognizable if you're a person who pays attention. And there are lots of, it's strange because the same point made in the context of a comedy show goes over very differently in terms of relative to an essay or a podcast I found. So when like Dave Chappelle or Chris Rock makes a joke about Black men loving expensive rims on their cars, and a Black audience laughs in recognition. Or Dave Chappelle's old reparation skit where you get the reparation check one day and everyone spent it on a gold chain the next day. When you have Black audiences laughing at this, they're laughing because they understand the comedian is not coming from a place of hatred, and it's very fun to poke fun at one's own community over recognizable cultural elements. But then if you take that point seriously, if we are going to endlessly point to the 10-to-1 racial wealth gap between, say, whites and Blacks, are we actually serious about that, or are we just doing it in order to tug the strings of white guilt? Because if it's the first one, how could we not be interested in the fact that Black people as a poor population are routinely spending more money on luxury goods? So I think I made the mistake there of assuming that people actually took the racial wealth gap and solving it seriously. In many cases, they don't. I think it's really just a way of, as Glenn Lowry once put it, waving the bloody shirt of racism in the face of white Americans for eternity. At the end of the day, though, I am much more interested in in bringing up the people at the bottom than in closing gaps. Whether that gap is an IQ gap or a wealth gap or what have you, ultimately, we could get rid of those gaps just by knocking the top people down. And there's been, some philosophical work on this too. It actually doesn't necessarily make sense to care about gaps in themselves, unless your whole picture of human happiness is dependent on everyone being equal. And there is something to be said for equality in terms of how groups perceive their own well-being. However, ultimately what we should care about is poverty in absolute terms, not just because that's a more feasible project than closing gaps, but because it's more directly connected to lessening human suffering in this world as I see it. So if anything I said there provoked thoughts in you.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
No, first of all, right on. But I want to go a little bit deeper on a couple things. First of all, I totally agree with you about the ability for Dave Chappelle to say lots of things that if you try to say them in the wrong context, you'll be skewered. And, this is why we have humor. And thank God for Dave Chappelle. But so years ago, when I was a grad student, I was working with a professor, a very famous evolutionary biologist named Bob Trivers. He's one of the greats. And Bob, for reasons that come from his own past, is actually a white guy who identifies as a black guy. He's just happier around black people.
Wasn't he involved with the Black Panthers?
Yeah, he was a Black Panther.
Yeah.
He was.
And he knew all the heavy hitters, right?
He was best buddies with Huey P. Newton. He was Huey P. Newton's PhD advisor, got Huey P. Newton degree in evolutionary biology because he felt it was the key to Black liberation, among other things. Anyway, Bob's a very interesting character, and I spent a bunch of time with him in the field. And so we talked about race and what he thought. And, at one point, I remember, I think I had just traveled to Jamaica to start my work there. And I had noticed a pattern. The pattern was that, I go to get on an airplane and I dress down. I dress to be comfortable because airplanes suck, right? And the Black people that I was traveling with did the opposite. And I thought, why is that? Right. And I asked him, and he told me. He said, look, it's harder. And for Black people, the ability to dress yourself in some way that suggests something, that advertises some achievement, is more readily doable than to, let's say, get a house that sends the same message. And so there's something about the confinedness of the individual that causes display to happen more locally to it. And there's sort of a sense, you get on an airplane, you're on display. And so anyway, I thought that was a very interesting answer. And I must say, I even notice, aspects of this in myself, right? Heather and I have a truck that we use for utility stuff, and we have a car. And there's something about the car that I try to keep pristine, because it's like the one thing in my life that can be perfectly organized and, doesn't have major defects. And so there's some sort of it's a limited enough thing that I can keep it in some condition that doesn't send the same message as my crazy cluttered desk and all of that. And I guess I would put one other observation here. When I was a kid, most of my friends, just because of the schools I went to, I guess, were Jewish or white of some other variety. But I had a couple of Black friends, and their homes were very different than the homes of my white and Jewish friends. The homes of the Black kids were absolutely exquisitely maintained, right? The taste was very different, but it was like inside the home was almost museum-like, right? There was things were kept in their place, and there were very fine objects. And it was just it was a home that sent a very different message. And I had the sense that there too, there was something about if you have reached a level of achievement and you're sending this message about what that level of achievement is, it's broadcast in the signals that we put out. And so, now as an evolutionary biologist, this is much more straightforward. Human beings are constantly advertising stuff. It's not a dishonest phenomenon. It's just a normal part of life. What we advertise has everything to do with what kind of opportunities and hazards exist around us. And so I don't know exactly what the reason is for what Thorstein Veblen would have called conspicuous consumption with respect to jewelry in the Black community. But I guess my point would be, if you drill down there, it may not be a wise investment of resources. On the other hand, if you're buying gold, it's not like it loses its value. So it may be a way of establishing some level of achievement in some way that is measurable by others. And we ought to at least recognize that the advertisements that we ourselves make are largely invisible to us, right? We wouldn't register them as advertisements. We'd have rationalizations for why we do this and that. But when we look at other cultures, even within our nation, right, we may see things that are conspicuous to us because they wouldn't work in our circle, and so they're obvious.